whenever you were doing anything of a larger nature, you would move your software from server to server to server. So initially, what I would do is I had all these C routines and early form of Perl script routines available, and I would load them from one server to the next and sweep all of that server, basically, and then go on to the next server and so on. So at that point, I was grabbing whatever was publicly available to me on that machine, which could have been their email storage. There weren't forums per se at that point.
Okay.
There were some replicas of the what they emerged from, which is the old BBS system that used to exist, which probably predates most of the listeners. But in any event, so initially that's what it started off with. As it has morphed over time, we now find ourselves concentrating on chat cluster repositories. We never mess with emails anymore just because it's way too much problem to get involved, and there are actually a lot more filtering involved in that than anything else, especially with all the spam. But these days we find ourselves reading all the public pages, the blogs, the comments that are on blogs, and forums, and then responses to and replies to all the messages.
Okay.
Basically in that order. There does not appear to be, insofar as we've been able to analyze, and I've never run the test to really determine it down to the gnat's ass, but there doesn't appear to be any favored submedia there for us getting more accurate predictions, say, out of text logs than over forum chat. Anything we pick up, it all goes into the same thick, syrupy mass. When we do differentiate, it doesn't really seem to depend on where we read, so there's no point in concentrating on one more than the other.
Okay, that makes sense. And at what point along the way did you realize that what you'd created was starting to make accurate predictions as to what would happen? What was the big moment?
That was 97.
Okay.
Yeah, that was early 97. It took me a number of years to get the whole system together, because first I had to write a whole group of software chunks that we call the spiders that go out and find this stuff. And they had to morph over time because the internet grew very rapidly. So in 93, I could let them loose on servers, but by 2003, that was way forbidden. And really, that had started to fade by 98. And so we're constantly screwing around with the spiders at that stage to refine our gathering technique. But in 97, I did a very large run. I ran the data spiders from about June of 1996 all the way through to late December of 96. There wasn't as much internet, for one, and so it took a lot longer to get the same volumes of text that we were dealing with.
Right.
Bear in mind that I had just come from an environment that was phone companies, and then when I was working for the phone companies, we were processing, hundreds of millions of records at a time. So that was the quantity I was thinking of, that I needed to have that kind of mass. Maybe it's not necessary. I just started off that way, and I've never changed, so I don't know. But in any event, I figured more was better, and so I ran it for 6 months, and then I sat there started doing the interpretation in probably November of that year, of 96, and it wasn't until probably early March or so of 97 that I actually had what we would think of as a report, where I had all the data interpreted and had started to make some conclusions. And that was when I had my oh shit moment.
Okay, great. And I guess before we go into what you see coming through the WebBot in 2011, I just want to ask you personally, what is your own opinion as to what it is that makes humans just a little bit psychic? What's the source of that? Do you have any clue?
Sure. It's actually patently evident. My viewpoint of reality is that reality is not materially solid. That the idea that one atom could ever touch another atom is a fiction that borders on absurdity. Mm-hmm. And that, in fact, all of reality that is manifest, A, is inside your head. There's nothing that is manifest in reality that is outside of your consciousness, nothing physically away from you. And B, that we're all basically standing waves of energy. Okay. That collect. And thus, since we are a standing wave of energy that thinks itself a solid being simply because its consciousness can't think beyond 60 frames a second, and reality as an energetic source is manifesting on the order of trillions of times a second, and so we think it is solid. But because we're a standing energy wave, we form what is known as an energetic antenna. And basically, we're like very complex, highly sophisticated versions of self-propagating, self-controlling to some extent, and self-energizing harps, in the sense of HARP, the big monster project in Alaska. Okay, we're a standing energy wave that walks through other energy waves. So, we pick up these other energy waves as we truck about. And it just takes a while for it to penetrate into our consciousness, which is bound to the grosser material, thicker world, and therefore doesn't see itself as energy and can't really consciously pick up on the new energy coming in, but it must deal with it, so it forces it into the material world, and in my view, it leaks out of our language and through our fingers when we type.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, I'll let you start going on what do you guys see coming so far in 2011. Of course, this is airing on January 15th, 2011. What do you see coming from this point forward? You've got I heard a big date coming up on January 18th where you predicted possibly another tipping point. Is that right?
No, it doesn't work that way. The January 18th date is related to the end of the release language that we're in now. We actually tipped over into a tipping point on November 14th.
Okay.
The week of November 14th, remember, we had an ICBM. Now, let's also stop for a second and define. You say, what's coming in 2011? Well, horrific joys and terrible chaos and doom and gloom and death and so on, lots of births and lots of happiness and lots of pain. It depends on where you are and who you are.
Sure.
So, now, here in the United States, we've got a particular situation, but let me back up and say that from November 14th onward, we've been in release language. This was a very atypical thing for us. We'd never had it. We had a tipping point on November 14th, which I argue still occurred on that date, but there are a lot of people that say, well, it actually happened on November 8th when the release language began with the ICBM that was launched off the coast of California by the Chinese. Don't let anybody tell you it wasn't a Chinese missile.
Yeah, that was always my suspicion.
Right, and all of the other naysayers and so forth and the arguments that they have against it are all misdirecting and using different tactics, and they're not debating any of the actual facts. So that began the release language. It did not overwhelm the building tension language, and basically we live in a, let me stop for a second and give you a bit of background. We live in a dualistic universe. We are energy, but we think ourselves matter. This is the good, bad, all of that kind of stuff. We have a tendency to define everything as ones and zeros or in a binary fashion.
Right.
So I did so way back when by deciding that there were two forms of language, basically, relative to the emotions being expressed. All of those emotions that are building tension that cause anxiety and silent acceptance of anxiety, fear, or even joy or whatever, but they work on your stomach and your solar plexus. So a building tension language is something that causes your stomach to spasm and tighten, your muscles to tighten, that sort of a deal. Whereas release language is where your muscles release and the language flows out. And so it could be the same kind of anxiety, but it's merely that it's being expressed as, yelling or weeping or whatever. So there are degrees of emotion attached to words built into them, and I was differentiating on different kinds of emotion as to being release and buildup, because humans in general, en masse, react differently to the various different kinds of language. I discovered this over 97 through 2001 as we watched the economic situation develop. In any event, in November 14th of 2010, we hit a tipping point, at which point there was more release language being expressed than building tension. Obviously, there's always both being expressed because we've got a huge planet full of people that are just chattering away like mad.
Right.
Okay, so the release language, we've been into it since, it's been dominating since November 14th. That release language domination has been fed and kept fueled by all the WikiLeaks stuff, by all of the North Korea stuff, by basically all the weather issues and so on that we've got going now, where people are grumbling and expressing their displeasure or pleasure with the events that are occurring. And they're just doing it with release language. That really ends on January 18th through the 23rd, and we go back to a period where building tension dominates. And usually, or not usually, but in the past 10 years of our work, we find that most frequently, more often than not, at any given time, you'll find that you're in the middle of what we call crocodile teeth, where you've got a bunch of release language one day or maybe for 18 or 19 hours, and then the next day you're back to building tension and so on. So it's up and down relative to the two types. This time it has been very rare because it's been totally dominated by release language, and it's just kept going on and on and on. Basically, 63 days was our forecast beginning on the 14th of November. Now, coincidentally, in the end of January, we have a solar occurrence coming up as well. And the solar occurrence is based on this, what can be defined as the mega sunspot cycle.
Okay.
And it has an 88-day periodicity. It's actually probably 87.45 days or something like that. But basically, we can think of it as 88-day periodicity. So there was a big brouhaha on the sun on August 1, and you count 88 days. We go to October 27th, and we get a situation where there was all kinds of solar activity then. And the next end of the next 88-day cycle is in the end of January. It is coincident with our shift to building tension language, and I cannot say from our data whether it is the sun activity that actually causes us to go into building tension language or triggers it or whatever. But nonetheless, the two do occur about the end of January. Now, there's a long way of coming back and saying that our next big date is actually January 7th. While we're in release language, and while the release language is running at predetermined, or not predetermined, but at a known rate of flow, our forecast showed that on January 7th, that rate of flow would increase radically, dramatically, for about 25 or 26 hours beginning on the 7th.
Okay.
And so tailing off until early January 8th. So we expect some level of increased flood of release language to come pouring out on January 7th, which I think is what, like Friday or something.
Right.
Probably it'll be economic, but beyond that, it's really hard to say. We have had all the economic problems that we'd seen developing. They're still ticking along here. Also, let me back up. Sorry.
No problem.
Our tipping point this time was unlike our previous experience with a tipping point. Our previous experience was September 11th, 2001, in which the powers that be engineered the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in an effort to force the populace of the United States into patriot reptilian mind mode so that they would go and kill people in Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world without knowing that they were being dupes of the powers that be.
Right.
Okay, so that tipping point changed the whole planet. This tipping point on November 14th also changed the whole planet. It's just that it's taken 63 days for it, in this time, for it to become more majorly felt. Whereas in September 11th, it was a much more violent act that occurred in a much shorter period of time and had the effect of changing the planet. Here it was a whole series of events that are at a huge level, much larger. Arguably, the ICBM from the Chinese off the coast of the United States and also the at the time, the potential for rapidly escalating war between North and South Korea, both of those had higher emotional levels than the attacks on the Trade Center.
Really?
Yes, they did. Because of the potential fear levels, they just ratcheted up very high. Then there was all the confusion, which kind of flattened out the fear, and then so we faded into release language. So it is an entirely different sort of a situation. I'm likening this to teacups, okay? On September 11th, we had a teacup that was 100% filled, and it was turned over and spilled.
Okay.
And so all the release language came out, all of it in a rush, and it was done relatively quickly. And a week later, we were back into building tension and being manipulated